Hey, folks, thanks for joining me for this episode from the Embellish Pod, an opportunity for me to ramble about whiskey or something for a few moments. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully, I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. And if you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com, and I'll get that taken care of. You can also find video versions of this podcast on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or TikTok with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's also a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. All right. So this afternoon, I have David joining me, and I'm going to give him an opportunity to introduce himself, and then we'll hop into some questions. So, David, if you would take just a minute or two and kind of tell us who you are.
Well, thanks for having me, John. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. My name's David Thomas Tao. I was born in Louisville, raised in Bardstown, primarily. Live in Brooklyn, New York now, so still a long way from home in many ways. I'm a media entrepreneur, television and movie producer, and spirits reviewer and writer. So I'm probably best known for co-founding a media company called Bardstown, which is actually about strength training and strength sports, not about being in a bar and drinking, hilariously enough. Built that up, sold that earlier this year, still actually involved pretty heavily with the brand, but not CEO anymore. And in addition, I am a spirits reviewer and writer. So I do a lot of writing for places like VinePair, Drink Hacker. I'm actually VinePair's primary American whiskey reviewer and writer. So a lot of fun there. And then I produce movies and television as well. Some of that I can talk about on this podcast. Some of it I cannot talk about on this podcast until some things hit wide release later this year. Obviously, with the writer's strike, which just recently finished, and the SAG-AFTRA strike still going on, I have to be a little bit careful there and a little bit cognizant of being in solidarity with those folks. And yeah, still live in Brooklyn. I feel like I'm at a really fun point in life, having sold a company earlier this year and exploring a lot of passions and having a great community, both here and back home in Kentucky, and really more and more around the world through the spirits community, which for me is by far the best part. The drinks are fine, the people are great. So that's my elevator pitch.
Mhm. All right, so you're a kid that's from what can only be considered as rural Kentucky, and you have elevated yourself going through Harvard and ending up ultimately in New York City. Um, how does that happen, right? Because I thought about this on the way home from dropping my kids off at school this morning. I live in rural Kentucky as well, and you're just as likely to see cows on the side of the road and a deer stopping your car here as you are in Bardstown, and you've gone from one end of the spectrum to the maybe the opposite. It's not exactly the opposite, but it's pretty dang close.
It's funny. I gotta tell a little story. My partner who I've been with for a number of years now. The first time I took her to Bardstown, um, we got there. I kind of warned her. I was like, "Hey, it's pretty rural in some ways. It's grown a lot, but."
Mhm.
And we get there and we're walking around downtown, and I go, "Hey, you know what, Jamie? I was wrong. Maybe I undersold this. This place has come a long way, and there's some stuff going on here. So I'm so sorry. I kind of sold it as being a bit of the backwoods." And just as I said that, a horse-drawn carriage pulled up to the stoplight, and it wasn't the horse-drawn carriage that tourists can hire. It was just someone getting around town in a horse-drawn carriage, just like pulled up to the stoplight, and the horse knew to stop because the light was red. I thought horses were colorblind. I don't even know how it knew. Um, and I thought that was really funny. I was like, oh, actually, we are in rural Kentucky. Okay. As far as how it happened, I mean, thank you for asking that, John. I was on a podcast recently and I was joking about Forrest Gump syndrome, where you just kind of say yes to a bunch of stuff and you end up going to a lot of weird places that you didn't expect.
Mhm.
That's what I feel, especially in recent memory. I have found myself in a lot of cool places, interacting with a lot of cool folks and types of folks who I never thought I would. And I feel really lucky because of that. So, I definitely didn't. I've never really had much of a game plan in life, which sounds really bad, and my therapist admonishes me for that sometimes. But I'm pretty good at saying yes to things, and I feel very lucky to have been able to capitalize on some opportunities. So, I went to boarding school for high school because I wanted some more educational opportunities. I wanted to be pushed, and I didn't think what was in Bardstown was really challenging me enough. And then I was lucky to, when I applied to colleges, lucky to get into my first choice. Fortunate. I mean, college applications are, you know, it's it's a coin flip.
Mhm.
Part of my friends, it's a shit show. It's not a real, um, it's not a real mechanism to determine who's worthy of anything. But I wanted to explore a new part of the country, and for me, Harvard, which is outside of Boston, Massachusetts, seemed cool. That's a big reason I applied there. Obviously, it's a big name, but I was like, yeah, I've never really been to New England. That seems like a cool place to spend 4 years of my life. A little colder than I imagined. I should have done my research. That's how it turned out. And then moving to New York after, I will be honest, I'd always wanted to live in New York. I read, um, books, articles, watch movies, and featured New York, and I knew that I wanted to spend part of my life here from a very young age. And so, getting the opportunity to do that right out of college, I was like, yeah, sure, let's jump at it, let's do it. So, um, very good at saying yes to things. I should probably get better at saying no to things, but hasn't led me too far astray.
Right, and it feels like, at least through the research that I did, is maybe you didn't have a game plan, but you were very adamant about acquiring skills along the way that would help you no matter what, whether it be through education, through personal experience, through what you've done. Like you seem very aware of acquiring the skills you need. Like, even in this interview, you're far more personable than a lot of people are that aren't necessarily used to this. You use my name regularly, and you thank people for asking questions. And you kind of have I think you had a mantra of, ask yourself a question before you ask someone else that. And so
Hmm.
there's a series of skills that are built along the way. Um, Growing up in rural Kentucky as well, at least in the '80s, I'm a little older than you, just a little bit. Um, there's this distinct perception that we derive about what New York is through
Mm.
video, through news, through whatever else. But when you actually show up, I guess maybe what was the thing that maybe struck you as surprising? And it may have been, a little bit slower of a change for you because you went from rural Kentucky to moderately decent sized Tennessee to Boston to New York. But like, what's the thing? Did you have like a preconceived notion that got immediately, kind of dashed, or was something confirmed, or?
Yeah, great question. New York is a lot friendlier than I thought it would be. People in New York we're a bunch of weirdos, right? New York attracts so many people who are into niche things. And I say weirdos lovingly, right?
Mhm.
New York is built around all these subsets of communities. It's so big and it attracts people who are interested in so many things. No matter what there's a community for, like you can find it. If you're interested in it, you can find it here. Like I accidentally ended up at a taxidermy event a few years ago in New York. Like completely didn't mean to, was like at the wrong place basically. And I was like, "Oh, there's like a thriving community for people who do taxidermy in their apartments." Like that's interesting. You can then apply that to whiskey. You can apply that to, part of my career for fitness. And finding those communities is a great way to make friends and make connections. Like New York is not the kind of place where you sit next to someone on the subway and you strike up a conversation and that's your new best friend. In fact, like don't talk to people on the subway. That's kind of like the unwritten rule. But it is a place where people really do work to explore their passions. Having hobbies here is not a bad thing. I think growing up, sometimes it was like in Kentucky, I felt, at least the people who are around me, that expressing yourself was a little bit uncouth sometimes. Exploring passions, if it wasn't whiskey, was a little bit
Mhm.
frowned upon. You kind of had to get in line with everyone else. But in New York, people aren't afraid to let their freak flags fly, and because of that, they're very welcoming to others who want to explore different realms of self-expression, be it through hobbies, be it through art, different interests, sports, athletics, you name it, food. That's one thing I love about New York. So if you can find those communities, oftentimes they're super welcoming, and for me, that's made New York just such a friendly place, and honestly, probably the friendliest place I've ever lived, which is saying something because the South has this reputation for being very friendly. Not that it isn't, but I think there is a desire in New York to form deep connections over shared interests, and I absolutely love that.
Yeah, in the South, I mean, and I like to call Kentucky the pseudo South because it's not
Yeah, very
completely the
much so.
South, but it's sort of the South. It's a gradient when you start from the top of the state and work your way to the bottom of the state. It gets more southern as you go, but South is very friendly to people of a like mind. But as soon as you start stepping outside of having different interests and different hobbies, things get a little bit more confusing. And I think it's softened a little bit over the years as the world has become flat and we have access to other people who have similar interests through the internet. It's a little bit easier, but it is an interesting thing, and this is something that I kind of was my corollary experiences. If you go to a place like New York, um, if you move 4 miles north of where you are right now, likely it's a completely different community. You're not going to see anybody. You can rebuild yourself anytime you want to. You can find access to any community that you want to be a part of, um, almost without any sort of restriction there. And you seem like you've kind of entered into multiple different communities, whether it be whiskey or fitness or theater, voice acting, all of these other things. Um, you have some credits to your name in the voice acting realm, or not necessarily just voice acting, just acting, producing, a whole host of things. And you said you can talk a little bit about that. How do you were you looking for this, or did it just happen because of where you were, or was it because of your interests in theater at a younger age?
Yeah, I think I definitely had some theater interests at a younger age. In high school, I was really into theater. We were talking a little bit before we started recording about speech and debate and forensics, and I think actually Kentucky's a really great place to grow up if you're into that sort of thing. There are a lot of programs stemming out of WKU, Western Kentucky University, and other places that make that really accessible. So I've always been interested in performance and visual expressions of art, if you will. For me, getting involved in play production in New York, which was about 10 years ago, was just me saying yes to some opportunities. And that was a really great, fulfilling series of experiences. Also very challenging because as a play producer in New York City, I was really good at losing money, which is not sustainable. So that's why that is not my day job. And
Mhm,
then moving into the voice acting realm was something that I thought would be fun, something that a lot of friends encouraged me to do, enough to where I was like, cool, I'll do it. I'll start exploring this in a focused way. Had some friends who are actually audio engineers who encouraged me there, and then more recently have moved into TV and film production. And my hope is, as much as I don't necessarily have a plan, my hope is that if we talk a year from now, I'll be able to say a lot more about that with a lot more experience and a lot more conviction. But right
mhm,
now, I'm still very much in the learning phase, and I've had some great opportunities to get involved with some projects. Again, some of which I can talk about, some of which I can't. To get involved with some really fantastic projects from people I truly admire and have looked up to for a long time, and that's been really cool. Uh, I think that heading into 2024, figuring out how to be a little bit more discriminating as to which projects I want to get involved with and how I want to focus on helping them is going to be a real challenge, because I need to figure out where my skill sets lie in that realm. Like, where can I bring value, and where am I not really going to be able to bring a lot of value? That's something that I am wrestling with right now.
mhm.
Good problem to have, good thing to keep you up at night, right? If you're thinking about like, well, which movies are we going to do? But that's been a real joy and a real learning experience, and I'm still very much, I think, finding my sea legs on that.
Mhm. And you talk about a lot in a lot of the other podcasts and that you've been on about kind of being the best at a thing, right? So with Barbend, were you in a position to be the best at the thing you were doing, or do you need to hire somebody else to do that? And it sounds like like the rest of us, learning to say no or not now is incredibly difficult to do, especially when you have a lot of things in front of you. So what kind of bringing things back into the Kentucky lens? You've been in and around whiskey, bourbon, whatever you want to kind of name it, since 7. You did the tour where you put your hand in the mash, and
Yeah.
I've thought about that moment a lot in my life, because for every bottle that particular producer makes, there's some number of people's hands that have been in the mash that you're purchasing, which I know through distillation it gets rid of germs, but it's
It's called
you know
terroir in Kentucky. We just
exactly,
call
yeah,
that, yeah.
but I worry about some people's personal sanitation, and like how clean was their hand before it went in. It's just a weird thing you think about from time to time. Regardless, what brought you back into this? Because you go through Harvard, you build up Barbin, you're incredibly important within the physical fitness community, and then you're starting to do this thing which might even be opposed to physical fitness, because you're effectively consuming poison,
Yeah,
small
yeah,
quantities of poison over
yeah.
time.
Small,
So like, what
sometimes
brings you back
moderate
to this?
quantities of poison if you're
Yeah,
not careful.
right.
I will say that we were talking about skills earlier, and I never thought drinking whiskey could be a skill, but it is something I sure worked on for a number of years. So I'm glad it finally
Mhm,
paid off. I'm glad we can call it a skill these days. I get paid to drink whiskey now. I mean, who would have thunk? I feel like
mhm,
I like to call my mom occasionally and just remind her that I do get paid for that. So parents' predictions aren't always correct.
mhm,
But in all seriousness, I've always had a connection to whiskey because I grew up around it. Not only did I grow up in Bardstown, I grew right off Distillers Row. I mean, I grew up on Second Street. Distillers Row is third, and I grew up around that. Went to middle school with a lot of master distillers right now and some head distillers.
mhm.
If you want to I'm not going to name names, but it's pretty
Yeah.
easy to suss out. Grew up with those people. They were my friends. We were in Boy Scouts together, and it was Bardstown back then, even more than it is today. It was everything. It was all consuming. I mean, Bardstown, my playground smelled like the sour mash from Barton because it was right across the street. So I've always had an interest, but to be perfectly honest with you, John, for the first few years I lived in New York, I didn't like telling people I was from Kentucky. People
Mhm,
had preconceived notions as to what that meant. They had stereotypes, right? And occasionally, I can't say they were necessarily wrong because it was based off of things. It was based off
yep,
of stuff they'd heard in the news, based off interactions they'd had. I met a few people who had been to Kentucky decades ago and they hadn't had great experiences. They had felt like they weren't welcome. And I'm a proud Kentuckian, but that really did hurt me. And then so I kind of hid that light under a bushel for a while. I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud of the fact that I wasn't really forthcoming about that. But with the bourbon boom and the increase in whiskey tourism, I think people started to see Kentucky in a different light and they started to have real positive experiences there, right? They started going there to visit distilleries. A lot of folks would say they'd go there with a mom or a dad or a grandparent, who had never had the opportunity to go to Jim Beam, but had been drinking Jim Beam for their entire life. And that was
mhm,
really cool. And people started seeing whiskey as a way to connect with folks. And that was probably around 2015, 2016. And I realized I didn't have to hide that part of myself, right? I was
mhm.
born and raised in Kentucky, have lived outside the state for a while, but it is very much a huge part of my identity. And being able to own that a little bit was really freeing. And whiskey was always a part of that. So as my career progressed in media and as I made more connections in the bourbon community and as I started using that as a lens to reconnect or a mechanism to reconnect with home and spending more time back in Bardstown, um, I realized it was okay to embrace that. And so I have been doing stuff in the whiskey industry, I think, for a little bit longer than people might expect based on just the bylines that they
Mhm,
see for my reviews. I've been investing in the spirit space. I've been advising venture capitalists in the spirit space for a little bit. And then when I actually had the opportunity to start doing writing and people started approaching me with those opportunities, it became easier to say yes. Right. It became a
mhm.
way for me to kind of reconnect with that part of myself and what I grew up around. I joke that being from Bardstown is a bit of a cheat code in the spirit space. People kind of
Right.
automatically take your palate
You're an
seriously.
expert.
Like,
Yeah, absolutely. You're an expert.
yeah, growing up in Bardstown, it doesn't mean I have like a good palate or that I can write, but people hear that and they're like, will you review this for us? Will you write for my site? I'm like, based on what qualifications? Like, I just grew up there. But hey, you know what? I never thought being from Bardstown would be anywhere close to a superpower.
Mhm.
If it is in the spirit space, let's take advantage of that. Let's
Right.
do it.
I mean, it may open the door, but you're going to keep it open with the content you produce. And in that vein, back in July, you wrote an article about Bardstown's fight to remain the bourbon capital of the world. And I really enjoy this article for a couple of reasons. Is I was at an event right before the Kentucky Bourbon Festival where I first heard the term the urban bourbon capital of the world. And I immediately had this thought in my brain, like, okay, so this makes sense for Louisville proper to kind of adopt that because they are quickly doing that. But what does this mean for Bardstown? Like, is it going to supplant? And you have a lot of people that are saying, we should pull the Kentucky Bourbon Festival to Louisville because of accommodations, and it's hard to find a hotel room or a place to stay when you're wanting to come down for the festival. Um, it, what's the key thing you think that Bardstown needs to do to keep that?
I will say, I'm so glad we're talking about that article. That one took a lot out of me because I put a
Mhm,
lot into it. And it's probably the piece of spirits related writing I'm most proud of. And it might stay that way because it is personal.
Mhm.
And it was difficult for me in writing that and in drafting that to figure out how much of myself to put in there. And then I realized that I had to be nothing but honest with the reader. So I had to say, like, I start off that article like, hey, I grew up here. Right.
Mhm.
I have to show my bias. I really didn't want people to find out after the fact, like, wait, he's from Bardstown. He's going to be biased toward Bardstown. I
Mhm.
am. I want Bardstown to grow and thrive. Like, I have an interest in that. And I it was really freeing to talk to my editor and be like, "Oh, let me just lead with that." Right? Let me
Mhm.
just show my perspective and not be like a third party arm's length narrator here. What does Bardstown need to do? Bardstown, you nailed it. It has to invest in best in class accommodations for people. Now, it's catching up. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, if you people would ask me where to eat in Bardstown, and I was like, I don't know, go to my mom's house, ask her to make you something. Like
Yeah.
I go to Hardee's for breakfast. Like there just weren't that many options. I love a Hardee's breakfast, by the way. I'm just
Mhm.
gonna say that. Shout out to Hardee's. Um, Now we're seeing that catch up. We're seeing there are great food experiences in restaurants at the distilleries.
Mhm.
There are some great food experiences outside of the distilleries. Accommodations are still behind. Now there are some new hotels and inns going up, but yeah, if you're like a corporation and you want to take a group of folks down to
Mhm.
Bardstown for a bourbon experience, or or you're a bachelor party or a bachelorette party and you want to take 12 people down, like where do you stay? That's still the big question mark. And I think that part of the hesitation for that is it's really expensive. It's really expensive
Mhm.
to build hotels. Like, right? Like, I'm not
Yep.
going to do it. I don't know how to do that. I don't want to raise that capital. But I think Bardstown certainly needs that. Look, Bardstown's never going to have an international airport like Louisville, Kentucky,
Mhm.
right? So there's already a difficulty in getting people there because it's very difficult to fly directly to Bardstown. Like you can if you fly on like a little 3-seater prop plane, right? And
Yep.
people aren't doing that. At least most people aren't. So how do you overcome that inertia? You have to make accommodations worth it. I think that the distilleries are really doing a good job building experiences and building
Mhm.
up more there. I think Heaven Hill opening their new facility, their new distillery there is going to be a real game changer because I think it just adds one more hallmark major producer experience. And I think that's kind of needed, just like one more to
Mhm.
get people to spend the night there instead of spending a day there. But then where do they spend the night? It's all about
Right.
accommodations. I think you nailed it.
Yep. And I mean, I feel like, and you may have a different opinion, but I feel like it all begins with Bardstown Bourbon Company, and if they don't do what they do, then nobody else necessarily has to raise their game. But Bardstown puts in effectively what I consider to be uh, one of the best kitchens in the state of Kentucky. Right, their
Yeah.
restaurant is fantastic, their experience is great, and now everybody's playing catch up, and so now it's how do we build an experience to match or beat?
I completely agree with you. I also do want to give a shout out to the bar at Willett, which
Oh yeah.
opened not too long thereafter.
Hmm.
I think people don't realize it was not quite concurrent, but close. Because Willett, great food, by the way. It's a
Yeah.
smaller environment, right? It's like a much smaller setup, the bar and kitchen at
Mhm.
Willett. But their bar program, oop, sorry. Some sirens going off here in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
It happens. Apologies.
No worries.
Can't control that.
I mean, if you could find a way to control it, you might be the richest man in New York.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that would be. Yeah, I'm not Mike Bloomberg, so
Right.
um, wow, they were just really
It's a very serious situation, sounds like.
basically parked right outside there. Of course, this happens right in the middle of a great podcast.
So while you're waiting, are you
There we
still
go. It's
using the
moving.
name?
It's moving. It's moving.
You got
Okay.
okay.
So I do want to give a shout out to the bar at Willett because it's great food and great hospitality, but it's a true bar program. Now they have that at
Mhm.
Bardstown Bourbon Company too. I want to be clear. You can get a great cocktail at Bardstown Bourbon Company. But what Willett did was, I think, create a full bar experience. Sure, you can pay $300 for a pour of some 27-year-old sourced Willet. Great. Awesome.
Yep.
I've done that. Maybe regretted it the next day, but done that, had a great time. Eating great food. But their cocktail program is, I think, world class. Like as a New Yorker, I go to a lot of high-end cocktail bars, right? I try and get into a lot of high-end cocktail bars where I can't get a reservation. But I go to a lot of cocktail bars that really style themselves as being among the best in the world. And then I go to Willet and I'm like, this is just as good, if not better. Right. And to get that in Bardstown, Kentucky is really something special. And I hope that more distilleries realize it's not enough just to have a bar that serves whiskey. If you really want to attract people and you really want to create a sticky, cool, good environment, you got to expand your bar program beyond just the neat pours, right? People want cocktail. Drinkers are smarter. They've been exposed to more. They want cocktails. They want that full mixology experience too. I don't want to drink neat whiskey for 3 days straight, right? And I love neat whiskey more than the average person. So having that holistic program is something that I do want to give Willet some credit for.
Yeah. I mean, and you made a really, 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 really good point there. And I've always sort of viewed the bar at Willet is a fantastic cocktail program with really good food, and the Bardstown Bourbon Company's restaurant is a restaurant that has a bar program, right?
Yeah.
And so they're sort of positioned slightly differently, and they both have great. I mean, like the egg salad sandwich at Willet is super phenomenal. It has its own Instagram page.
Don't even get me started.
It's a real thing. But that's not the only thing that's good there, and they're super accommodating. It is a very intimate feel, whereas Bardstown Bourbon Company feels very much like a really nice restaurant, and that's not it's not a denigration or anything like that. It's fantastic, but it's a restaurant through and through. And I've got like tons more questions, and I know we're getting really, really close on time, so I want to kind of whittle a few down. And it feels like you're very keyed in on storytelling, brand storytelling, telling your own story, whatever it happens to be. As far as distilleries, do you think that they're, who's doing it best and who's doing it worst? I mean, maybe you don't want to answer the second one, but who's doing the best version of storytelling about what they are?
So I'm not necessarily going to say this is not necessarily the best, because the more I think, the more I'll come up with ideas, right? I think Maker's Mark's doing a great job. And I think what they did with their recent cellar age release, which is the first age dated Maker's Mark we've seen, is they have baked in the story of the brand to the story of that bottle. Why have we been around for 70 years and we hadn't released an age dated whiskey yet? Well, that became part of the story, right? And I think they're doing a really fantastic job every time they release a new product, baking in the story and ethos of their brand. Right. And they're having fun with it. They're like, oh, sorry, we're late to the game on age dated whiskey. No, you guys have wanted for it for a while. We're finally doing it, but here's what it took. I think they're doing a really great job as a major producer. I think a lot of brands are doing really fantastic jobs. I think that when it comes to, like, we're thinking Bardstown, I know Maker's Mark is in Loretto, not technically Bardstown.
Right.
But that's just one that pops to mind. I love how they position that bottle, and the story of that bottle is the story of the brand, right? That's 11-year-old whiskey, but it's really 70 years of Maker's Mark history.
Yeah. And I'm a little bit of a Maker's Mark fanboy as well. There's a whole bunch right here, and there is a cellar aged as well. And it was one of the most anticipated things. I stumbled into a friend that works in the spirits industry in Louisville back in February, and he had somehow acquired an over matured bottle of Maker's Mark, and they were floating around Louisville proper for a while. And I tasted it then, and then I was like, okay, if this is going to hit the marketplace, it's going to be phenomenal. And they've made a name for themselves by not changing drastically over the last, 40 or 50 years. But we've seen innovation from them without changing drastically. But I know they also have TTB approval on a wheat whiskey label for 2024, which is immediately on my radar of things that people should be paying attention to next year. What is maybe the most exciting thing that's happening in whiskey for you?
I think the craft scene is the most exciting thing. I think craft producers aren't afraid to push the boundary of flavor. And I think that craft producers are saying, hey, even under these strict regulations, whether it be bourbon, whether it be the emerging regulations around American single malt, whether it be rye, they're having a lot of fun, and they're really pushing the boundaries. They're saying, look, we have these like bumper lanes we have to operate within, but we can really do a lot within those. And I think you're seeing that actually trickle up to the major producers, which are playing catch up on innovation, flavor profiles, things like that. You can do a lot with a 51% corn mash bill requirement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think craft producers are showing a lot of that. I'm really lucky. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I live not even 2 miles from Kings County Distillery, which I love, right? Shout out to the folks over there. I'm pretty close with some of them. It's bourbon, but it's bourbon unlike anything you'll get in Kentucky, right? And they're still experimenting, and I love that.
Yeah, and then their participation in Empire Rye as well. I had the opportunity to have a craft whiskey panel with David from Whiskey My Wedding Ring back in January, and Kings County was a part of it as well. And I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think craft is it. And you went to the Kentucky Bourbon Festival. That's where all the people were. Right? All the people
Yeah.
were in the craft portion. Not to say that they weren't paying attention to the heritage distillers, but there was a lot of innovation in that particular area. And I think you're tight on time, so it's probably time for us to wrap this up. Where can people find you? What should they be paying attention to? And are we going to see David as a consultant to spirits brands, helping them tell their stories better?
Well, I appreciate it, John. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm not the most active on social, but getting better. I'm following a lot of people's advice. I'm on Instagram at David Thomas Tao. I'm on Twitter at D_Tao, D_TAO. Well, formerly Twitter, now X. I don't know where you're going to see me next, but I'm still doing a lot of writing and reviewing and trying to stay prolific on those ends. I love hearing from people. And I'm in a very different place in life than I thought I would be a year ago. And that's all a very good thing. And I'm excited to see, how saying yes to stuff continues. And then honestly, the best part of this, like I said, is getting to connect with people like you, John, because people beget opportunity. And getting the chance to come and talk to you about a little bit about my story and about whiskey and about everything in between and about Bardstown, it's something I never thought I'd have the opportunity to do. So I'm very, very thankful for it. And I hope I get to continue doing a lot of this no matter where life takes me.
Thanks for tuning in to this offering from the Embellish Podcast. We had a really great conversation with David, and I know there's at least a dozen more questions that I want to ask him, so hopefully we'll have him back on here in the very near future. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform that you happen to be consuming this on. Leave me a comment if possible. Hit me up on social media at TikTok or Instagram using Embellish Pod, and give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can be found at www.embellishpod.com with all of my links, accounts, contact details, and more. Thanks again for stopping by.